Hello everyone, Jules here. Today I'd like to talk about quite an interesting book by a well-regarded author. That book is titled Mysteries, and this is written by Colin Wilson, and the unofficial subtitle is The Powerful Sequel to the Occult. And the Occult was Colin Wilson's first book of this genre. Now this is a reissue. This book was published in recent years in 2020 by Watkins Books, and it's quite a thick book, so it makes a great reference book. And this book is really quite an overlooked gem. It's a really great reference book. It's very interesting. It's kind of a combination of the paranormal and different topics about the paranormal and or metaphysics, if you want to think of it like that, and also esoteric and supernatural topics. I read the first book, The Occult, many years ago and was quite impressed by that, and it was a very popular book in its time. And this book, I've gotten this new reissue, the recent reissue, because I had not read the second book, Mysteries, for quite a long time. And it was not until I looked at this again and realised, what a great gem it is, because there's some great sort of obscure pieces of information in here. It's a bit of a who's who as far as the esoteric, well-known people of the esoteric world are concerned. But I think this book is different to the occult. The occult is more of an overview of esoteric topics and the sort of well-known people in connection with that. This one is more of an investigation. And I think an investigation for these topics is a great idea, because Colin Wilson was quite an impartial author. He had an interest in these topics, but he was able to keep a distance in regard to being too biased. So I think that's really good. So I'm going to talk about what's in the book, but it's just such a worthwhile book. I think it's been quite a number of years since I looked at this book, and I had read an older version quite a number of years ago. I had forgotten about it, but it wasn't until this reissue that made me realise that it's worth looking at. So I'll just talk about the contents. There is a foreword by Colin Stanley, who is the editor of the book, and he's also in charge of the archive of Colin Wilson. Excuse me. So Colin Stanley is a bit of an expert on Colin Wilson. You've got an introduction to the new edition, to this edition, and there's another introduction in here about a theory of Colin Wilson, and it's called the Ladder of Selves. The Ladder of Selves was Colin Wilson's theory that the paranormal could be explained by the idea of higher selves and lower selves. I know that in some areas of magic there is the idea of the lower self And I know in New Age topics there is the higher self. This is the idea of multiple higher selves and multiple lower selves. It's also a bit similar to a theory that Gurdjieff had as well. I personally don't really agree with that, but it's interesting to read that introduction, to just think about Colin Wilson's explanation for paranormal episodes or paranormal activity. And I think the thing to keep in mind with this book is that it's a great reference book, and I think the main thing about this book is the wide variation of topics, because Colin Wilson was a great researcher. I mean, this book still stands really, really well against any other books that are written now. There is an index in the back of the book, which is very much required. This book is about 650 pages, so the index is required, but there is a great contents, the way that it's set out. I'll talk about that as well. You've also got a very good bibliography, all of the books. There are some pages of notes in here, but not too many. The bibliography is very good, and I like the index. I find this book quite accessible because of the way it's been laid out. The format is good. So I'm going to talk about the different parts. It's divided into 3 main parts. But before I get into the contents, I just want to sort of show you what the contents are like. Even for the introduction about the ladder of selves, which is Colin Wilson's own theory. I mean, he just completely lays out, what is in that. I mean, this here is a listing of everything that is mentioned in the ladder of selves introduction, for example. So that's really helpful, because you could just browse through that and say, oh, that's really interesting, I'd like to have a look at that. So I think that's really helpful with the contents page. He calls it an analytical table of contents. I would call it a content summary, but that's what he called that. So part 1, for example, part 1 and each of the separate chapters, it's the same thing again. You've got all these different listings here of what is in that chapter. So, that could be really useful to people. You haven't got the page numbers in the content summary, but you have got the general content listing in the front. You've got the different parts of part 1, part 2, part 3, and you have got the page number for each chapter, which is all you usually need. But you have got that analytical content or summary of what's in each chapter as well on other pages. So just to talk about what's in this book. There is a foreword by Colin Stanley, who is the editor. There is the introduction to the ladder of selves, and even with the ladder of selves, I mean, that is just something to keep in mind, in the back of your mind for yourself. I mean, you don't even have to think about that again if you don't want to. It's just letting you know that when Colin Wilson wrote this book, he had a theory about the ladder of selves, and I think that did stay with him all the way through, towards the end of his life. He still had his own theory about the ladder of selves. So in part 1, you've got ghosts, ghouls and pendulums. So they go straight into the supernatural, into the paranormal. You've got a chapter called the Timeless Zone. and a really interesting chapter called The Path of the Dragon. And then part 2, you have got the rediscovery of magic. Then the next chapter, Descent into the Unconscious. And I think this book is really good as well for looking into different levels of consciousness, because Colin Wilson was very interested in that. There's a chapter called Worlds Beyond. There is another chapter called Ancient Mysteries. And there is another really interesting chapter called The Powers of Evil with a question mark. So that is interesting as well. Just to look into that topic, because Colin Wilson was interested in a lot of things, and he also wanted to investigate these things because he was just curious, and he wanted to always try to find the cause of different things. But this book is interesting. It's not too dry. It's a very interesting book, mainly because of the wide range of topics that are in here. That's why it makes such a great reference book. But I also love some of the more obscure pieces of information that are in this book. Really, really handy. Part 3. I think part 3 is very interesting in the way that it brings it up to modern thought. And I mean postmodern thought as well. It's really postmodern thought. The first chapter is called Evolution, which is including very much the evolution of humanity, which is an important topic to consider. The next chapter is Messages from Space and Time. I mean, these are the kinds of things that we are still considering now. We're still considering these things in the postmodern era. You know, this book was written in the early postmodern era. We're in the later postmodern era now. Then you have a chapter on the mechanisms of enlightenment. Now that is a really interesting area to look at as well. People are often talking about enlightenment, but they don't talk about the mechanisms of enlightenment. How does that occur? What is going on in the brain? The biological side of the brain versus the mind, because they are two different things. And then you have another chapter called Other Dimensions. And then you have the notes, bibliography, and index. These are just some of the things that are in this book. There is a lot in this book, and that is why the index is so useful at the back. It's just a fascinating book, totally fascinating. I mean, I've just opened that one page now in the Rediscovery of Magic chapter, and of course it's mentioning alchemy. It's just, and Carl Jung and things like that. I mean, it's just a truly fascinating book. And this book did influence people who are writing in this genre today. And I can understand why. It's really worth getting. There's probably quite a few people watching who did read the account many years ago, or even in recent times, because these books have been reissued by Watkins. But this second book, by second book I'm saying there was a trilogy. The first one was called The Occult. Then there was Mysteries, this is the second book. And the third book was called Beyond the Occult. Beyond the Occult is a more materialistic view, because towards Colin Wilson's later part of his life, he became more sort of materialistic, he had a very dry, mechanistic view towards the end of his life. But this was written earlier. I think this is a better book. I like this the best of the trilogy. So I think this is just really worthwhile. I really like this book. Mysteries, The Powerful Sequel to the Occult by Colin Wilson and edited by Colin Stanley, published by Watkins. It is really worth getting for people who are interested in the paranormal topics, esoteric topics, the supernatural, and it's a great reference book. So I wanted to talk about this today, let people know about this book, and just sort of letting you know what a great reference book this is. It's certainly an overlooked gem. I mean, I had overlooked this myself in recent years, and it wasn't until this reissue became available that I got this. I've recently bought this book, and I'm looking at this again and thinking, wow, this is, looking at this again now, it kind of fills in a lot of pieces to the esoteric puzzle as well, and it's very worthwhile. So I'll put some details below the video for people who are interested. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.